Going live.
안녕하세요. UK톡스 웨비나 시리즈 2탄 그 마지막 세션에 참석해 주셔서 감사합니다. 저는 주한용국문화원 교육사회실 소속 엄선현입니다. 팬데믹에도 불구하고 양질의 교육과 커리어 개발에 대한 열정은 좀처럼 식지 않죠. 작년 12월에 진행했던 학부 편에는 400명이 넘는 분들이 등록해 주셨어요. 그래서 이번에는 저희가 석박사 유학 그리고 커리어 개발을 주제로 총 11개의 웨비나로 다시 돌아왔습니다. 이번에도 300명에 가까운 분들이 기꺼이 귀한 시간을 내어주신 만큼 유익한 시간이 되기를 바라며 마지막 세션 시작하겠습니다. 이번 세션에서는 아트 디자인 전공에 대하여 높은 경쟁력을 지닌 영국의 유수대학교 3곳의 교수님들과 함께 지속 가능하고 경쟁력 있는 예술과 디자인 산업의 미래에 대하여 이야기 나누겠습니다. 노리치예술대학교의 마리 브레넌 교수님, 골드스미스 런던대학교의 마이크 월러 교수님, 하트퍼드셔 대학교의 이완 윌코 교수님께서 각각 15분씩 준비한 발표를 해주실 텐데요. 그에 앞서 간단한 당부 말씀드리겠습니다. 본 웨비나는 약 1시간 동안 영어로 진행될 예정이고요. 연사분들이나 참여 대학에 관해서 궁금한 점이 있다면 채팅창에 질문해 주세요. 지금 백스테이지에서 각 대학의 담당관들이 대기 중입니다. 답변을 드리기 위해서. 컴퓨터로 접속하신 분들은 채팅창을 우측에서 확인하실 수 있고요. 모바일 기기로 접속하셨으면 상단에 물음표 아이콘 눌러주시면 됩니다. 채팅창에서 공감 가는 질문이나 마음에 드는 답변이 있다면 좋아요 버튼 눌러주세요. 발표 종료 후에 시간이 된다면 질의응답 시간에 좋아요가 높은 질문 위주로 답변 부탁드릴 예정입니다. 웨비나 종료 전에 랜덤으로 한 분께 약소하지만 저희가 마음을 담아 준비한 선물을 드릴 예정이니 끝까지 자리 지켜주시면 매우 감사드리겠습니다. 그럼 지금부터 시작하겠습니다. Hi speakers, thank you so much for waiting for our opening in Korean. We are now ready to start our first presentation. So everyone, I'm honored to introduce the first speaker, Professor Mary Brennan from Norwich of University of the Arts. She will talk about the COVID-19 challenges for the creative industries. Dr. Brennan?
Hello everybody, 안녕하세요. My name is Marie Brennan. I'm delighted to be here with you this morning, and I'm just going to talk to you about some of the challenges for the creative industries, but also what that actually means for us, because as people who are imaginative, maybe we have a lot in our power that we could help to change and create a better society. So could I have the next slide, please? So as I say, my name is Marie Brennan and I'm a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and a member of the Institute of Designers in Ireland. And I'm also work as an advisor for the British Council Arts and Creative Industries Group. Through all of these roles, a lot of the thinking within these organisations is how can art and design change not only itself, but how could it help build a better society? We are all aware and are experiencing firsthand the challenges that COVID is creating across the world. But as creative people, maybe it is in our gift to imagine and create a new reality after the virus settles. Next slide, please. While doing this research for some of the organisations I've been associated with and also working with our own students, I became aware of a perfume brand called 4160 Tuesdays, a very luxurious kind of cult perfume brand. And the perfumier, Sarah McCartney, has a blog. In the blog, she was stating that the world now cannot go back to normal. So with her company, she said something which I found very, very impressive, which was that we should look at the challenges constructively. And in planning, we need to look at ways to go sideways to different or forward to unusual, because we can't go back to normal. Next slide, please. So by using that premise of sideways to different or forward to unusual, how can we change our work if we're going to move in different directions? Firstly, I think we must identify these challenges. Next slide, please. It's not going to go back to normal because there really isn't normal, and we haven't got time machines. So as designers and artists, we're usually the ones who are the first to react to change. And we kind of create change. If you look at fashion design or product design, that is quite often where the energy is with regard to changing our own aesthetics in the world. An MA course will challenge students to find their own solutions through research. And indeed, in the UK, we have a framework for qualifications, which states that on completion, MA graduates must demonstrate that they are able to make decisions in complex and unpredictable situations. And what have we got now? A very complex and unpredictable situation. So in some ways, the COVID situation is asking MA students to try and help find solutions or find new ways of working, sideways to different, forward to unusual. The challenge, therefore, is in some ways offering us all a quest to respond to COVID through the work and the ideas that we generate. So what are the challenges that we are facing? They are numerous, both similar and yet different for each person and each situation. Some of us are dealing with grief for loved ones, and also grief for our dreams, which we think have stalled. We have to get used to planning for change. And in project management, to not just develop one plan, but to have a number of plans, what is known as scenario planning, something that designers and in the arts world, the artistic curator, are particularly pretty good at. So if we have a look here, we can see some of the challenges. If you look at the popular press throughout the world, we see the challenges are around our own health, but also mental health, because we're living in a world with increased anxiety. Quite often we need to be able to build a sense of community while we've been isolated and cut off from each other. So these are some of the challenges with the works that we need to try and reduce. We also have increased inequality and inclusion, which the COVID crisis has amplified. And then, of course, we have climate change, pollution, mass extinction, and the problems that are rising out of the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is the current archaeological epoch that we are in. Humans have become the single most influential species on our planet, causing things like global warming and changes to land, our environment, water and air. This means we have to be very careful not to further upset the balance by rising to the challenges of COVID. The COVID crisis gives us a chance to think about our world and our people and how we may want things to look or work in the future. And artists and designers can use their imagination and creativity to help find solutions, as well as helping us to interpret and reflect upon the age in which we live. The next slide, please. So, as designers and artists, we need to think more about making things last and to embrace a world with no more planned obsolescence, no more making money, the idea about making money, but ensuring we embrace what's known as the triple bottom line in creative enterprise, which is planet, people and profit. And it's possibly that we can think of it in that order. We need to think of our carbon footprint when we travel. Maybe we should only travel when it's really meaningful for us. And we need to lobby companies such as Apple, etc., to provide longevity in the goods they design and make. For us as humans, we also need to think about what do we need something, as opposed to how much we might just want it. The next slide, please. Although fashion is seen as one of the most polluting companies, fashion is also one that's had great progress in responding to not just COVID challenges, but also the broader challenges of society. For some, we have a sharing economy, and in the Hyatt Denim Company, who are based in Wales in the UK, they rethink about what ownership means in fashion, and maybe we can share fashion in the future. These baby shoes that you can see here are by a brand called Cub baby shoes, who use eco materials and vegetable tanned leather, as well as creating vegan alternatives. So in the time of uncertainty that we have a time to reflect upon how we might want to change. And as we are all starting to make changes, I think the idea of the challenge is this idea about living more closely in harmony with nature and creating better production technologies so that we can have a much cleaner world in the future. The next slide, please. The Purpose Disruptors are an advertising movement, an advertising company who set up their own creative response to the World Economic Forum's Great Reset. And the Great Reset is a cultural movement to maintain the positive environmental behaviours that we have all developed during lockdown. And they use this so that we could reset ourselves, reset our work and reset our impact. They wanted to work with companies to help them advertise products that were more ethical and companies that were providing goods that were rising to the many challenges that we are facing within the COVID crisis. The next slide, please. One of the things that many people are doing, particularly responding to the challenge of community, is developing online work or online interactive works. Artists and curators in particular are acknowledging that we no longer have to receive art in a big gallery or a national museum, but we can access it in many places. Therefore, the challenge to the artist and the curator is to look beyond replicating a white cube gallery, but look towards making more meaningful digital experiences that unite us all. The work that you can see here is from Team Lab, who are a Japanese company who work across international borders. They've got a really, really lovely project called Flowers Bombing Home, where they ask people to draw a flower and then upload it onto their site. And there's a live 24 hours a day YouTube channel which shows these flowers that you have made with people across the world. So it's a constant bouquet that we can play in our own homes. The image on the right hand side is a wonderful project called Window Swap, where people across the world have been asked to film the view out of their window for around 10 minutes. We can then engage with others. We can see the world through their very own eyes by looking through their own windows. It's extremely calming, so it also responds to the challenge of the anxiety that we are all feeling. So online interactive and collaborative works is one way to look at the challenge. The next slide, please. What I've got here is after the Great Reset, what then? What will we be doing in arts and design? I wanted to show you two pieces of work from our own MA community. The one on the left is a campaign for a project to reduce social isolation for people who are alone during COVID. And the one on the right is more reflective. It's called Plague Ground, and it was made by a fine artist on the MA course at Norwich University of the Arts. And it's about how we are in a way festering in our houses, and also is a reflection on the disease itself. So that's very much a reflection. The next slide, please. So the challenges for art and design industries are not so much the COVID itself, but it's being able to harness our power to pathfind and to lead in times of difficulty, and to have the confidence in our own creative imaginations. If you look at the quote here from the theatre company Border Crossings, it will be from the cultural sector that the essential new ideas emerge that will help us address globally the challenges that we find ourselves in during COVID. And then my final slide, please. So I want to say thank you. This is me, this is the University of the Arts. There's a small link there if you wanted to see more work from our MA students and how they themselves are responding to the challenges of COVID. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mari. It was very interesting presentation. I believe the attendees would find it very helpful. And let me introduce the next speaker, Professor Mike Waller from Goldsmiths University of London. He will talk about the future of design and creative innovation. Dr. Waller?
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm Professor Mike Waller from Goldsmiths University of London. I'm going to give you a kind of range of things we're thinking about in relationship to kind of post-COVID, what we're going to do next. Okay, next slide, please. So obviously design faces so many challenges and we're really interested in rising to those challenges. Next slide. So at the moment we face a whole series of crises in humanity, from the population explosion to sustainability to looking at repositioning design to take, you know, a central role in that responsibility. Next slide, please. We're facing a crisis in health. Obviously, we've all got to figure out how to deal with some of these huge challenges that we're facing. Next slide. This is a view of the London Underground, which is empty, you know, so we are in a very strange kind of context that we've got to move forward from. Next slide, please. So design is a very, well, it's a socially engaged practice. Next slide. So I thought I'd start with this kind of quote from Donna Haraway, and it's all about thriving. But I think one of the things I think is important about this is it points to this idea that actually decisions that we make as designers have to somehow be in the presence of the people who are going to bear their consequences. In other words, the people who are going to live with our designs, we need to bring them close to how we think and consider the world within our projects. Next slide. So this is the sort of central thread of the MA in design at Goldsmiths, called MA Design Expanded Practice. And we're post-disciplinary. So in other words, we want to move beyond the traditional confines of design disciplines to get you involved in establishing new types of practices, which are kind of hybrid. They bring different areas together and change how we think about what design can be and what it could do in terms of changing the future in relationship to how we've now got to kind of transform ourselves in our new society effectively. Next slide, please. But this starts with you. In other words, we're really interested in what drives your curiosity. Yeah? How do we make you the best designers that you can be? And what do you bring as your, you know, from your experiences? So in other words, the enthusiasm of curiosity is absolutely central to your creative practice. And this is what we want you to really kind of draw into this program. So it's very focused around how we can make you the best designer. Next slide, please. We do lots of public outreach. So one of the kind of key things is we're really interested in experimentation and materials. So this is part of our connection with the Institute of Making at UCL, that we work with them on giving kind of public engagement through design into materials. Next slide. We also run live projects. So we have a studio called the Pi Studio, which some of you may be aware of, because we also have a studio in Seoul at Hanyang University. So we work in partnership on live projects, bringing the kind of different communities together to think about how we can do things as a kind of global community. Next slide, please. And we do big projects like thinking about what the future of radio might be. So in other words, thinking about how new types of forms of kind of broadcasting start to take place. So obviously many of you are probably bloggers and make your own films. And the same can be said of radio. Maybe we need to reinvent how radio kind of works. Next slide, please. So here you can see thinking about kind of landmark radio, or as you move through a space, new types of media experiences, or when you're part of an event, you know, how do you broadcast? How do you contribute to a community through radio. So that's a kind of live project. Next slide, please. But we also do research. So all of our academics at Goldsmiths are interested in these big questions about how do we get publics engaged, or how do we use design to change the world, or how do we think about the future through design. So this is from our interaction research studio, which is working with the BBC. So if you go to the next slide. So we work on kind of public broadcasting to get people engaged in building kits to watch nature in their back gardens, but then to use those design skills and teach skills of making to help people kind of change their own experiences. Next slide, please. So we're talking here about designing with publics, you know, not in isolation in the studio, but getting out there into the community and really trying to understand how design can challenge what could be, you know, what our futures could be. But you're part of that, you know, what do you think the future should be, and how do you engage with others? Also, you know, doing things like looking at protests. So we've got here a picture of, oh yeah, you can go to the next slide there. We've got a picture of a child in London making a kind of chalk mark on the road to protest about the kind of services that they want as kind of young people in a city. So we're trying to really interestingly explore how we can empower people through design. Next slide. Okay, so we also obviously build maps and use different approaches to explore communities. So we call this kind of civic design. We're working with the Design Council in London to explore what design can do for kind of civic engagement. So these are some of the maps that the MA students made. And also working with community psychologists. So we don't just work with other designers, we also try and work with other disciplines and expand design in that way. So this was from a mental health project where we designed instructions on the left to help people build their own problem-solving booths, to help them have those conversations about mental health in their communities, and exploring how we can help each other as part of our communities. And this made it onto our local kind of London TV, and lots of kind of activities around trying out these booths together. Next slide, please. What we kind of call this is amplification. So we run symposiums and bringing experts in from around the world. So we had a guest speaker called Alistair Ford-Luke, who wrote Design Activism. And that kind of opens up the questions about, well, how can design actively change things? So it's not just about doing more programmed type design work, but also actually proactively getting out there and transforming things. But this means you have to learn different types of skills. So the next slide, please. So things like deep listening. Yeah, how do you really understand the people that you're working with? How do you become an insider rather than an outsider imposing your ideas on others? So this notion of us engaging more sensitively with communities is really important. Next slide. So at the centre of this is design methods and processes. So we try and teach you a range of skills. Next slide, please. To equip you to be really, you know, amazing professional designers and be able to talk to each other and develop your practice through learning ways of researching, ideation, engagement, kind of all sorts of different types of things. Next slide, please. So engaging with kind of materials and new types of prototyping equipment. We have extensive prototyping labs, from 2D printing to 3D printing to you know, metals and plastics and casting and textiles and everything like that you can bring together to make your prototypes. Next slide, please. But we also question how we use our process. So this is like a list of different ways of using modeling within your design process. So not just at the end to present things, but in terms of thinking about how you engage, say, for example, the body, so movement models or performance models or time-based models. So we build these kind of ways of talking to each other as professional designers to really expand what design can mean, but also as a profession ourselves to talk and build up that culture together. Next slide, please. We develop our own methodologies or develop others, so thinking about how time works. So these are some of the diagrams that we use around pulses of change, to think about at the top there incremental change, to go right the way through to things that think about what the long-term future could be and how we may backcast into the kind of present, or how we may forward project, like you can see that Polaroid camera, a lost archetype that we really loved, and bring it into the now. Or think about possible futures like global kind of internet networks that run at low-level satellites. You know, that's the future we want. So how do we make that now? So we use lots of tools to explore these things. Next slide, please. But we also build models together of time. So this is a project we did in Daegu at the CCI, the Creative Campus, building a big timeline together to look at social transformation and technologies. So building models that we can all talk about together, kind of socializing the design process, is really important to us. Next slide, please. As is using performance. So we use a lot of kind of performative activities to tell stories. You know, one of the big central activities of design is the narrative, the storytelling that we can create, but using our whole bodies, not just our brains, and engaging in kind of real physical activities around thinking about how we may invent possible ways of telling those stories together. Next slide, please. And also students make their own processes, you know, they build their own explorations. This is about sustainability. So what are the impacts? What are the relationships between materials and society? Or, you know, ethics, or understanding the politics of an object. Next slide, please. Some of the work that I'm doing on focuses on bringing design and neuroscience together to look at behaviour change, but also to try and understand how we can think differently about the relationships between knowledge and design and objects. Next slide, please. I guess at the centre of this is making prototypes together. So next slide, please. So coming back to the idea of telling stories, these are a lovely kind of pair of toys that were aimed at young kids, so they could tell stories about their grandparents. They weren't just playing with kind of cute Barbie dolls, but they're thinking about how they could make narratives through the props that they use. So if they haven't got these kind of tools, do they tell different types of stories? So next slide, please. Or thinking about lighting in relationship to other senses, so whether it's smell or taste or touch. So this chocolate lamp on the right that melts chocolate as it's on, or a raspberry light on the left that tastes. So things like pushing the boundaries. Next slide, please. Or cross-cultural design. So this is a Korean project that we did. So really fascinating cultural observation. Koreans don't put pins through their artwork like we do in the UK. So these are little pins that hold the edges of things, but have little characters in relationship to different characters within our different cultures. But those little cultural observations are really important for design, to understand how they're kind of different. Next slide, please. Or making, so this is a self-blogging soapbox, so it captures the speeches of political protest and presents them online, so people can revisit their local kind of conversations around politics. So again, making prototypes. Next slide, please. And then I just wanted to end with this idea of imagination. And I think this is key to design, is that actually what we're trying to do is develop your imagination. And we think this is the sort of source of human achievement. And obviously we're biased because we're kind of creative practitioners, but we want you to engage and develop your skills as post-disciplinary designers. Go beyond the disciplines and apply your own skills to being the best kind of designer that you can be. And we want to do that with you within our studios at Goldsmiths. So thank you very much. And that's so last slide, please. That's the end of my presentation, and here is my contact details if anyone wishes to get in touch. But it's been a real pleasure to talk to you today, So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mike. I enjoy your presentation very much. So thank you. Thank you. Now we have our last speaker, Ian Woodcock from the University of Hertfordshire. He will talk about the post-COVID-19 opportunities and career prospects in the arts industry. Dr. Woodcock?
Hello, everybody. Very, very nice to see you all here. I'm going to really build on the presentations you just heard from my colleagues, and I'm going to absolutely want you to hold in your heads all the sort of ambitions and analysis of design processes that you've heard, because they're absolutely central to what I'm going to say. My focus is going to be on careers, and really on your career. You know, and you've started already taking the first steps in that by recognizing that, you know, as you come to the end of your undergraduate, or maybe you've already finished your undergraduate, that actually you maybe want to keep on learning. You're thinking about postgraduate study. So what I want to do is I want to give an overview of where we really are in the creative industries. I want to look at the effects of COVID on that. And then I want to look at some of the things that you need to make sure when you're positioning yourself, when you're actually thinking about which steps to take in your future career. Next slide, please. So the first thing is, of course, is that, you know, we haven't had a static society before COVID. Things didn't stay the same. Things were already moving. And one of the big changes that certainly I've noticed, and probably you've noticed as well, is that over the last 20 years, you know, things, physical things, have been replaced by digital things. Bits have replaced things, as Nicholas Negroponte said. Now, of course, this has had lots of interesting consequences for the design process. You know, so screens have replaced paper. People have been looking at tablets. People have been looking at e-readers. You know, screens have been getting larger and closer to the body throughout all this thing. And what this means for us as designers is that there's an assumption that instead of designing for print, we're designing for screens, that instead of us actually giving a user text, we're assuming that they'll have some control over how that text is presented to them. There's a, you know, the way we read text has fundamentally changed because of this digital change. We've also seen that actually physical artifacts, which used to be absolutely central to how large areas of the creative industries sold and distributed their products, they've largely disappeared. I'm sure all of you have watched movies online and have heard music online. You know, that used to be unthinkable only 20 years ago, where, you know, you had to buy an optical disc, and before that you had to buy a record or a video cassette or something. Things have completely changed there. We can also see that 3D printing, we're at the beginning of a change process there. We're already seeing 3D printing becoming much more capable, becoming much larger. And we're thinking, do we need shops still? You know, if actually you can look online and see something, download it and print it in your local printing shop, do we need design shops? Do we need furniture shops? If those things can actually be produced, you know, without makers, as it were. Next slide, please. COVID, of course, has affected all of our world, and what I've got here for you are just some of the ways that things have been changed by COVID and have been intensified by COVID. The first thing, of course, is that you and I will have experienced that we were our own. We were in our houses, we were in our rooms, in dormitories. You know, we weren't going out and seeing other people. We were stuck inside, and that network connection, the only real connection we had with the outside world, became more and more important. And when we're looking at cultural products, you know, our experience of them changed. It used to be that we went to the cinema, we may have gone to galleries, we may have, you know, gone to the theatre or been to a concert. That stopped. Our experience of cultural products became individual. We were isolated and we just had to experience those things on our own. And the surprising thing was that, you know, that worked pretty well, actually. It's not as good as what we had before, but actually those sectors of the industry that were able to use that form of distribution, they were able to keep working. Now, not every part of the creative industry could do that. And so production was certainly interrupted. But in some industries, for example, film and TV, after a short time, once they'd worked out the protocols and how to do it safely, they were then able to restart work. For other industries, I'm talking about games particularly here, they were very, very good at working online anyway, because, before COVID, there'd already been a huge consolidation of computing power, and almost all large games companies work with server farms and then people in different parts of the world actually doing the work. So for them, there was a very, very short interruption in terms of production. And one of the interesting things is that the effect of COVID across the creative industries is not uniform. Only yesterday, there was a report here in the UK that actually the UK games industry grew by 40% over the COVID period. That's a large amount. And of course, it reflects the fact that people were stuck at home and playing games. But if you look down and drill down into the detail, software sales for making games also rose, which means people were making more games. Employment rose, people were still hiring, they just didn't have studios. So one of the things I want you to really take on board is that it's not everything that's affected in the same way. We didn't have shops, of course, but that didn't seem to matter. Actually, an awful lot of people bought an awful lot of things. And I don't think we're going to go back to shops anymore. We're going to think about things are different there. The one big change was that distribution was much, much easier if you could distribute over the network. In other words, chairs and physical objects were quite difficult to buy, particularly when distribution chains were locked down or they were sort of preferentially going over to medical equipment. But things that could be distributed over the network, those still sailed on, and we all liked them, because frankly we had nothing else to do. We were stuck in our rooms, we could look out of the window, but we couldn't really do much more. So that network connection became absolutely vital for us. Next slide, please. Now, in the context, this move to digital from things meant that actually, the creative industries were changing anyway. And one of the changes, the rise of AI and experts and digital assistants and that sort of thing, that's affected a lot of industries. And there was an assumption that actually creative industries would be pretty immune, but that's shown not to be the case. What I want you to think about when you're thinking about your career is to really identify those areas of the creative industries that will be affected most and those that will be affected least. And really the key here is that, what can humans do and what can computers do? So if we're looking at, what computers find most difficult, they find creative thinking and decision making difficult. They also find communication, human to human communication, most difficult. We're all used to there being sort of telephone systems where you're talking to a computer voice and eventually you get through to a real person who can actually deal with something. That's very, very difficult still. That's very challenging. It's not to say it can't be done, but it can't be done well, and it can't be done in a very flexible situation. So if the assumption we had before COVID that really, as people working in the creative industries, we didn't need to worry about the rise of AI, we didn't need to worry about expert systems and robots. If that's not valid, there are some parts of this process, and of course, you've seen already this morning, and I hope all of you are aware that the design process is not a uniform process. It actually is in a number of different stages, and each of those stages have different outputs and different skills requirements. So some parts are going to be affected, and our job, or your job, when you're looking at your careers, is to think which parts of that are least affected. Now, as I've said before, some of the creative industries were not that affected by COVID, really, because they happened to chime already with the changes that COVID sort of pushed on. So, networked working, distribution of production, networked delivery of products. If your part of the industry was already doing that, you were much less affected by COVID. One of the things I think that COVID has definitely shown is that for a lot of parts of the creative industry, there was an assumption of the need for a physical location. And yet, when we had to start working from home, when we had to close the factories and close the offices and the studios and the workshops, we found actually we could keep on working, we could keep on being productive. And certainly games and animation, those industries were able to keep going pretty much unchanged. You know, there are some creative meetings they weren't able to hold, but they managed to do that without too much trouble. And I think now we're going to see an awful lot of companies thinking, how much do they really need those large offices, or how much do they need those large studios? Or in fact, instead of that expensive, cumbersome, inflexible infrastructure, do they perhaps just need a differently trained workforce? Next slide, please. What I'd like to do now is just take a couple of minutes to show you a couple of examples to look at the sorts of changes I'm talking about. So the first one is a system from Microsoft, Sketch to Code. And what this does is quite simply, you draw a pencil sketch or a pen sketch of your web page, you show it to the AI over the network, and then you get back the HTML for your website. So in other words, between the sketch and the almost finished website is just a computerized artificial intelligence system. Now, we used to be told that, you know, the most important thing was that all children had to learn to code. But Tom Hume, who works for Google's investment arm, said in an article in 2008 about what we expect children to learn. He said, deep machine learning will likely automate the writing of code relatively quickly. While it's useful to know what comprises languages or algorithms, I suspect most of the latter will be written by machine against a specific human or eventually machine query. Here's the important part. Creativity is going to be far more important in the future, where software can code better than we can. So what's that saying is that, you know, the making part of human HCI, of interface design, is going to become less important. The really important part is the sketching, is the ideas, is the creativity right at the beginning. Okay, there's one other thing, of course, is that there's a lot of research efforts around at the moment aimed at developing UX assistants. In other words, computer programs that help non-experts produce interfaces that are good enough. They may not be as good as the best human interface designer can produce, but they'll be good enough for most purposes. And that's something we also need to think about when thinking about careers. Next slide, please. Now, this is a Canadian system, again, an AI version. And what happens here is that you draw the shape of a building plot. So, you know, where the building is going to stand, or in a field or in a street or something. And from that, the AI will generate a floor plan for your building. And then it'll develop the rooms inside that. And then it'll put the furniture layout in that. And it does all this not by generating it, you know, by random numbers or something, but it looks at millions of building plots and says, okay, what's the most sort of common types of building that architects, human architects, have put on this geometry of this plot? And then, okay, given this building footprint, what is the most common and ergonomic sort of layouts of rooms for that particular building footprint? And okay, you've got these rooms with these doors and windows. What are the most used layouts of furniture and fittings in those rooms? So this isn't a computer generating without any human input. What we have here is taking all of the human input up to that point in time and then using that to project new models. And, you know, you can see that from just drawing the field your building's going to be in, you can get right to the finished building, including the interior design, in one fell swoop from the AI. Now, of course, you may say, yeah, but how good is it going to be? And there are two answers to that. You know, one is how good were the buildings it looked at to develop this model, and there were millions of them. And the other thing was, how good does it need to be? It's a sobering thought as designers that actually a lot of design doesn't have to be brilliant. If you think about the role of the graphic designers used to spend all their time working on corporate stationery. I exaggerate slightly. These days, nobody does that. Somebody in an office, you know, uses a template, puts it all out there, and it can be printed if it needs to be, or distributed by PDF. In other words, design in all areas has actually receded a bit. Instead of everything needing designing. It's just the high profile projects, those ones that are going to have a wide audience or a very high prestige. Those are the ones that, you know, star designers need to work on. The other ones, the massive products which still need designing, can be designed by people with less skill because computers are helping them produce a good enough result. Next slide, please. What does this mean for your employment? It means that, you know, the most important thing is that initial sketching, is that initial design. And that actually from that, computers increasingly will be able to produce those high fidelity, you know, things that look exactly like the finished project, things that can give the detail of the finished project, you know, and they'll be able to fill in all the gaps in drawings. They won't need a human to go through painstakingly every little stage. And those roles, I think, are going to disappear in an awful lot of design studios. And that's got some interesting implications for you in terms of how you get into those roles. We're still going to have professional designers. Absolutely clear that, you know, they won't be doing the low end stuff, but, you know, we're going to have professional designers doing high profile products. What will designers do is going to change, because they're not going to spend their time, you know, filling out the routine stuff. They're going to deal with clients and they're going to deal with suppliers, and that's going to be really, really important. The human side, the talking to people, the finding out what their problems are, you know, getting them involved in the design process. That's going to be really important. It can't be done by machines. Now, this last point is something you do need to think about, because if we see a rise of sort of AI computer assistants, in other words, they're doing a lot of the work that used to be done by people training in those industries, those training roles are going to disappear, which means that intern type roles are also going to be more difficult to find, because we won't have so many designers, so many interim designers doing what's called the routine work. You know, there'll be a designer who has the ideas, who does the sketching, and computers that do the rest. So that will make it more difficult, I think, to get internships. Next slide, please. So this is you. This is you, the new digital creative, working in one part of the creative industries. What skills are you going to need to make sure you have when you finish your master's degree? Firstly, you've got to know your audience. You've got to know them. Oh, okay, I need to rush through. Sorry, everybody. You've got to know your audience. You've got to be able to talk and communicate with them and find out things and that. And just go straight to my last point. You've got to be able to work more flexibly. So online working, absolutely. You've got to have higher qualifications to stand out from all the undergrads, and you're never going to stop needing to learn. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so just to make the point, the University of Hertfordshire, you know, we've got a very good reputation for, particularly for games and for other parts of that, and we are very good at employment. And I've just got my last slide, I think. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, my contact details there. I'm sorry to rush slightly at the end, trying to cram it in. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Ian, for your passionate presentation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. And as we have about 10 minutes, I'm going to pick up a couple of questions from the chat box and ask the academic speakers. All right, so my first question is, okay, I'll just read the question. Given that one of the key features in business environment and also in our daily life is digital transformation, how can design bring impact on our life in terms of digitalization? Or can we think of any connection between digital transformation and design? So I'd like to know which of you want to go first. Maybe you can raise your hand. Ah, yes, please do, Ian. Ian, then we'll do Waller, please.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, digital transformation is transforming the nature of design. You know, and I think the important parts of design are those starting points, the creative ideas, the ability to experiment in conceptually and sketch. I think sketching is a key skill, and one that will actually come to replace an awful lot of what I call sort of middle process activities. And the other thing is that I think it's going to really throw light on the need for human contact, particularly in design. Design absolutely has to be a participative process if it's going to be successful.
Yeah, I think I'd back that up. Sorry.
Yes, please go on.
I think I would back that up in terms of, it's absolutely a central part of design to really consider how kind of digitization and transformation in connected to the kind of interactive side of the world is changing. Obviously, on our MA, we have a studio that's dedicated to interaction and participation that asks these exact questions around digital convergence, trying to think about how we can kind of really push design into this space. So I think it's a good question.
Thank you. So, Dr. Brennan, do you have anything you want to, add to this one?
Yes, I do. I mean, obviously, my talk was about how we have to kind of respond very quickly to change. And I think, the digital world has moved on very much, in particularly around design, in architecture, and even, in the field of footwear design. I think there's also something around the digital world that we're finding with a lot of our students as well, is they use this phrase a lot called tactile starvation, which means it's about the materiality. So although that digitization can entertain through games and film, we also still need to have some kind of a presence of something that has a nice feel to it, that has good materials. So the idea of kind of materials being part of that process, it's something that there's two separate things really for design, and that it's the interesting thing is the place where those two meet in the middle for me.
Thank you so much for all of you about your insightful answer. And I'm going to pick up the next question, which is, okay. Do you have any particular areas in the creative industry in mind which you find the most promising in the post-COVID-19 era? So who would you like to go first? Okay, please go Ian first.
Yes, I think the evidence at the moment is quite clear that if you want to have a lucrative career in design post-COVID, probably games design is the area to be in. Having said that, I would hate it if all we produced was games. So, I would say, and I think, Professor Brennan's talk was very interesting. It really foregrounded the need for an ethics of design. And I think, people starting and thinking about postgraduate study really need to think about, what is a good career and what is what should a designer do in the world? And yes, if you're just interested in the money and in not being interrupted by pandemics, games design. But as I say, I'd really urge people to look more widely and be more ambitious about what design can do in the world.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe Dr. Brennan go first, and
Yep.
Waller, please. Okay,
Thank you. I mean, yes, I would agree very much with Ian really around those things, and there is also a lot of ethical things being done within the games industry, such as the Uncensored Library, which is a Minecraft game, which is actually a digital library which holds censored documents from all across the world, and so that enables us to work with a sense of freedom. For me, in the future as well for design, I think there's an awful lot of scope and interest in the field of biodesign, using new materials that are ethical and sustainable, such as bioplastics. And we have a particular student at the moment who's working with agricultural waste to develop paper. And there are those kind of ideas of where we can use materials and developing new materials for the future, smart performance-based materials, but also how we generate and have a full kind of a circular economy is really important, I think, in design. So materiality again is important in that field. Thank you.
Thank you. Please go for next, Dr. Waller.
Yeah. So I guess I would say a couple of areas really. Obviously, I think mental health is absolutely crucial for design to be engaged with, and I guess that's part of the kind of social design side that we're particularly interested in, which also then connects to, as you know, the kind of notions of circular economy and sustainability. And then I guess some of my own research around design and neuroscience and working with kind of artists to look at kind of direct feedback, how we can actually manipulate musical instruments from our brains, you know, directly. I'm really fascinated how design starts to connect maybe with some of these new technologies where we're kind of exploring new ways of creating music or whatever it might be. So yeah, lots of different areas almost.
Thank you. Actually, we have another question connected to this, and the attendee asked, she want to know is about the prospect of digital art, which requires intensive computer engineering knowledge. So any of you could answer for this? Maybe you can raise your hand.
Yeah, I can say a few things about that.
Yes,
yeah,
please.
So,
Mike, why don't you go first?
Yeah, okay. So we've connected to a group called the Music Tech Fest, which came out of some of our postgrads. But working with technology and design together to prototype using kind of physical computing to explore new ways of creating, you know, kind of interaction through our physical bodies and through our kind of connecting our brains and stuff like that. So I think, you know, it's the prototyping side I think that's so good for that comes out of design, is to actually try and make some of these things and try and explore how they work to understand the potential. So it's always about prototyping and potentials, which is something that we really, you know, kind of embrace in the design studio.
Thank you. Please go next.
Yes.
Ian, please. Yeah.
I think, you know, coding is important, and, you know, digital art, and it's a part of developing a technique there. Having said that, I think probably we need to recognise that, you know, creativity has been changed by the rise of the digital, and one of the most sort of worrying things is the replacement of sort of creativity by selection. You know, and the idea that actually when you're starting out in Photoshop, you select from a list of filters instead of sitting down with a piece of paper and thinking, what do I want to happen? What marks do I want to make? And so I think it's very important that we recognise in digital art that the role of software, but that we do so in an aware way, and we are also aware of how that technology may be limiting us and pushing us in particular directions that maybe we don't want to go down.
Thank you so much, both of you. And unfortunately, that will be our last question because of the time limitation. And dear attendees, if you have any further inquiries to the professors and the universities, please feel free to directly contact the university reps. You can find this information in the chat box too. And I deeply appreciate all the academic speakers and university reps for your wonderful insights and support today. So dear attendees, why don't you send them a thank you message in the chat box if you find this session helpful and useful. So we are going to, thank you. So we're going to pick up a person from the chat box for our present and notify the winner by replying to the comment. So please check your comment if you get replied, which means you are the winner. So please don't forget to follow us on KakaoTalk so that we can keep you posted about upcoming events and latest news on studying in the UK. So everyone, thank you so much for joining our last session today. We finally finished 11 sessions, and I hope you had a wonderful weekend and see you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.